Welcome to everyone today, and thank you for your patience as we worked through a few technical difficulties. And thank you also for joining this conversation about a proposed law that has been making headlines in recent days. My name is Bettina Krause. Welcome to everyone today, and thank you for your patience as we worked through a few technical difficulties. My name is Bettina Krause. I'm editor of Liberty Magazine, and I'm joined today by two of my colleagues to talk about the Respect for Marriage Act. This is a proposed law which has been working its way through Congress over the past few months, but it has really gained national attention last week when the US Senate took a significant vote to move the bill forward in the legislative process. So we wanted to take a bit of time today to talk about exactly what this proposed law is, and if it does become law, what it will do, what its impact will be. And I am delighted to be joined today by Melissa Reed, who is an Associate Director in the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department of the North American Division, and she has responsibility for government affairs. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you so very much. And my apologies for my contribution to the technical difficulties right there.
And Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the Office of General Counsel, both at the Seventh-day Adventist Church World Headquarters and for the North American Division. Welcome, Todd.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So now we have just glossed over your official titles rather swiftly, but I wonder if it would be helpful for this conversation if people understood the perspective that each of you is bringing to this discussion. So Melissa, tell us, what does your title actually mean in practice? What does responsibility for government affairs mean?
Right. Well, thanks for the question, Bettina. And again, I'm excited to participate in this conversation this afternoon. So what it means is that my primary job responsibilities are to advocate both for the religious freedom interests of the Seventh-day Adventist Church as an organization, and also the religious freedom interest of its members. Those are our two primary goals. Of course, we advocate for the religious freedom interest of everyone as well, but our two primary goals are those two areas. We do that in conjunction and in partnership with the General Conference Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Office. We take the lead, understandably, on domestic religious freedom issues, and the General Conference takes the lead on international religious freedom issues. But again, we work very closely regardless of the purview of the legislation. And of course, we are working and we're communicating and following the direction of our administration in what we do, the positions that we take, which pieces of legislation we get involved in.
Got it. Okay. What about you, Todd? What is a Deputy General Counsel?
So I am one of the lawyers for the church, and in particular, my portfolio includes religious liberty. So I work with the church at all levels on religious liberty issues, including our amicus curiae program, where we file briefs in the Supreme Court and other courts. I also handle litigation for church members and others that may have Sabbath problems or other types of religious liberty issues in the workplace and other places, and then also advise the General Conference and North American Division Council on Government Affairs on legal issues. And the issues that we're going to talk about today was working on those as far as bill drafting language and sort of what our position should be on the substantive legal issues.
Okay, so you are both very familiar, obviously, with the topic that we're talking about today, the Respect for Marriage Act. Let's start unpacking what exactly is in this proposed law. And Todd, there must be sort of a history or a context for this legislation. It didn't just appear out of anywhere. What drove some members of Congress to propose this law, and what's behind it?
Sure. So you'll remember that back in 2015, the Supreme Court decided a case called Obergefell, and that was a case that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. So prior to that, we kind of had a patchwork. Some states recognized same-sex marriages, other states did not. And Obergefell said, as a matter of federal constitutional law, a state could not deny a person both to be married and for that marriage to be recognized in that state. And that's been the law of the land since 2015. Earlier this year, in the Dobbs opinion that struck down Roe versus Wade, there were one justice, Justice Thomas, who, in his opinion, had raised the specter of revisiting the Obergefell decision. Now, that was explicitly disclaimed by the majority opinion. So the other conservative justices who voted to overturn Dobbs disclaimed that there should be any doubt on Obergefell in that opinion. And of course, presumably, the dissenting justices also would have no reason to visit. So it was one justice out of 9 that had said, well, maybe we should revisit this. This caused a lot of consternation in the LGBT community about whether or not same-sex marriage was, subject to be revisiting, as had Roe versus Wade. And so as a result of that, there was introduction into Congress of a bill called the Respect for Marriage Act, which we're here today, that would make it as a matter of federal legislative, not same-sex marriage. This bill does not require states to perform sex marriages. What it does say, though, is that states must recognize both same-sex and also interracial marriages of other states. So the bill does not, in fact, force states to perform those, but it would force them to recognize it. And it does that both for same-sex marriages and interracial. There was concerns, though it wasn't raised in the opinion, about revisiting Loving, which was the case, of course, that said that forbidding interracial marriages was unconstitutional. So that was the context of it. Yep. The practical effect of this bill right now, at least on the same-sex marriage side, is virtually none because that hasn't been revisited. It also repealed another law passed in the Clinton administration called the Defense of Marriage Act. That law had been held unconstitutional by an even earlier decision called Windsor.
Okay.
So there was concern that if the Supreme Court changed its mind, that those two issues could come back before.
Okay, so that context of uncertainty is what really propelled the proposal of this legislation. So, Melissa, you've been dealing more on the legislative side. Can you give us a history of this particular piece of legislation from its introduction to what happened last week in the Senate?
Sure, and I'm just going to step back a bit further and give some sort of political context, okay, which I think can be helpful. So when I started working in the public affairs and religious liberty ministry, that was the early 2000s. It was a much different political climate for religious freedom issues in Congress. For example, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed at that time with broad bipartisan support, and it was signed into law by a Democratic president, President Clinton. That is not the case today as far as the appetite or the enthusiasm or support for religious freedom in Congress, unfortunately. Instead, what we're seeing is religious liberty being characterized as the right to discriminate by individuals on the far left. And then we're also seeing it being repurposed by the far right as a means to compel Christian behavior. So as Seventh-day Adventist, we're concerned with both of those characterizations. So that is the context that we're living in. Todd mentioned the Supreme Court case. It bears pointing out that happened this past summer, right before an election, right in the midst of an election cycle. And so, the opportunity for, engaging your political base, I think, was a big part of why Respect for Marriage Act was introduced as well. So it was introduced in July 18 of this year in the House of Representatives. It literally passed one day later with a large majority of 267 to 157. And that included 47 Republicans voting in favor of the legislation. Again, when we're talking here, we're talking, in the past, we saw Democrats as really proponents of religious freedom issues. In this current context, we're seeing Republicans. That doesn't mean that one party or the other owns, this issue or is quote unquote right on this issue. But it's significant because the Republicans, first of all, hate voting for any legislation that is introduced by Democrats. They try to do everything that they can not to, and vice versa. But that said, it was very significant to see that level of Republican support.
Now, can I ask, Melissa, this version that was first introduced, it didn't have any religious freedom protections, right?
And that's exactly, yes. So, as Todd said, the legislation itself was very narrow in scope. It's very narrow in scope. But we, as a denomination, along with many of our other faith partners, were both concerned and surprised that any legislation that dealt in this realm, the same-sex marriage realm, would receive such broad support, despite the fact that, as you said, it contained no religious freedom protections. And so we immediately began working with our faith partners, a coalition of faith partners, to reach out to Senate offices, now that we've just seen it pass through the House so quickly, to express our concerns and hopefully engage on some productive changes in the text. So we worked with the staffs of Senator Collins, Baldwin, Portman, Tillis, and Sinema on an amendment to the legislation that contains provisions that address the core religious freedom concerns raised by the bill. Again, very narrow piece of legislation, but we wanted to make sure that they included those religious freedom protections. So on November 16, the Senate voted to advance the Respect for Marriage Act, which was kind of the big hurdle. They needed a 60 pro vote in order for that to happen. They got 62 votes. And so we expect that the amended legislation will become law following the Thanksgiving congressional break. So that's where we're at with this legislation.
Okay, so we now have a context for why the bill came into existence, where it's at now. Let's really dig into what's in the bill. So Todd, what does this proposed law, what would it do if it became law, and what doesn't it do? Give us the overview.
So its subsidy provisions, its most important provisions, is it provides that states must recognize the marriage that in another state. It has a provision in there, by the way, that was missing from the original House version that makes it clear that plural marriages or polygamous relationships, should a state, which they don't do right now, invoke that those would not have to be recognized. And so it does not federally say that states have to perform same-sex marriages. It's just that they would have to recognize those. And then the second issue it does is it does these in two terms. It repeals the Defense of Marriage Act, which was the Clinton-era law that defined marriage federally as between a man and a woman. And it says that the federal government will also recognize same-sex marriages. So those are the two primary subsidy provisions. I should also say it's same-sex marriages and interracial marriages. So both of those together it treats both of those the same as far as states recognizing them and it being the law of federal recognizes. So that's the subsidy provisions. Now, going on into there, it has then a number of religious liberty protections.
Right.
So the first is it borrows language from Obergefell about honest and honorable individuals, in religious groups, adhering to traditional marriage or, a marriage between one man and one woman. And that takes the language from Obergefell and makes that part of federal policy. So that's one of the important things it does. It also has a provision in there that makes it clear that religious organizations can't be penalized for refusing to perform same-sex marriages or using their halls or their facilities to facilitate those. So it provides subsidy protections there. And then the third thing it does is it has a provision that says that this law can't be used to discriminate against churches, for instance, on tax-exempt status and other federal benefits. Now, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth later, I believe, it doesn't, like I said, just simply says nothing in this bill can be used to deny tax-exempt status. So it limits the use of the bill, it provides subsidy of legal protections to religious organizations, and it also provides for that language that's in Obergefell now in statute as well.
Okay, so you've done a marvelous job in really summarizing that in just a few bullet points. But let's face it, this is a complex issue that we're talking about. It brings in so many different legal issues and potential concerns. And it seems to me that a proposed legislation such as this could really raise concern. It could cause confusion among some who are really just hearing about it for the first time last week. So if you're both comfortable, I'm going to throw a few questions at you, questions that reflect some of the concerns that some of our viewers may even feel about this legislation. So Melissa, let's start with you. And I think it's a question that we've implicitly answered, but let me just ask you this outright. Does supporting the religious freedom provisions of this proposed law, does this mean that the church is supporting same-sex marriage?
Well, absolutely not. And thanks for asking the question. So, the church has really remained consistent in its understanding of marriage, of family, of sexuality. That's why we've advocated in the way that we have for the religious freedom protections, in order to be able to be an organization that does hold what are unfortunately now is a minority perspective or understanding, right? And so, our goal is with this legislation to be able to maintain, the faith identity that is so valuable to us as an organization. It certainly should not be construed as support for same-sex marriage. We're very clear with the parties that we worked with, both, all of the advocacy groups that we work with, as well as the members of Congress and their offices. We were very clear with them, very explicit, and so hopefully that's communicated effectively.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, Todd, as you described the provisions of this proposed law, they sound great, the religious liberty protections, but I notice that they're focused very much on religious institutions, and they don't really deal with the so-called, wedding cake baker cases, those type of bakers where you have religiously motivated individuals in the secular workplace, small business owners. Why do the religious liberty protections not address those concerns?
Sure. One of the criticisms that's been is that this bill, quote, doesn't go far enough, right? And to some extent, we would agree with that. This is not a comprehensive religious liberty protection bill, and it was never designed to be that. The religious liberty protections are designed to address the issues that the bill, quite frankly, sort of implicitly or second order raises. And so you're right, there are not explicit protections in there for individuals, but that's because the bill does not really impact individual religious liberty rights, like the situations like you're talking about, like 303 Creative, where there was a website maker, Jack Phillips. Those are covered by other laws, usually state laws. And we are moving in another context. I think Melissa will talk about this to try to get broader protections in other federal legislation. But, when you're dealing with legislation, you've got to stay within the scope of the bill. And we felt that staying within the scope of the bill meant addressing the issues that it raised, and it does that, we believe, sufficiently. In fact, should this bill pass, we think that religious organizations will be better off than if it didn't, because the reality is same-sex marriage is the law of the land. It is really inconceivable that that's going to change. One justice expressing an interest with the 8 not doing that, in fact, explicitly disclaiming it. And what we now have is a second branch of government expressing the same views as the judiciary about same-sex marriage, heterosexual marriage or traditional marriage being an honorable and decent position to take. And that is going to be important if someone tries to go after tax-exempt status.
Right. Okay. So here, I'm going to stay with you, Todd, if that's okay. Here's a two-part question. I mean, is there anything in this legislation, should it become law, that would change the ability of religious institutions to make hiring decisions based on religious considerations?
No, it does not affect that. This bill does not impact in any way. It really changes nothing, right? It's the same-sex marriage and interracial marriage are the law of the land, and it does nothing to change those. So the ability of religious organizations to hire according to their beliefs is what it is right now, and this bill does not impact that either way.
Okay, and another related question, and I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to say, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The Adventist Church has a very large K through 12 education system. We have colleges, we have universities. would this legislation, if it became law, would it diminish the right of these schools to organize themselves according to the values, their religious values or beliefs? Would it impact accreditation, for instance?
No, it does not. It's in fact, it explicitly says that nothing in this bill can be used to deny rights, and it mentions educational institutions. Now, I do want to stress that protection is limited to what's in this bill. So, individuals who say, well, listen, this does not have an explicit protection for religious higher educational institutions or K-12 institutions across the board, they are correct. It's not in there, but that's because it's beyond the scope. As I said earlier, we believe there needs to be federal legislation, and we've worked towards that and supported that to address those issues. But I don't think it's a fair criticism of this bill that it doesn't fix every problem. The religious liberty protections are there and designed to address the issues that the bill raised, and we believe it does that. In fact, does it in a way that gives more protection, because what the bill does now is explicitly says a church that has these traditional marriages, which is the vast majority of religious adherents in this country, that is consistent with, I think, decent, honorable individuals, right? And that's the sense of Congress, and that's what Congress will have voted should this become law. And that would give support to anyone, say, for instance, like saying that, well, the U.S. has an overwhelming interest in denying, tax-exempt status to individuals who discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. This provides federal support on our side to try to bat down any attempt by the IRS to do that, as they did in Bob Jones University.
Got it. So, Melissa, I'm going to ask you, Todd's done a great job in sort of outlining the religious freedom protections that are there. But I'm going to pick up on what he said about some criticisms that this bill didn't go far enough in protecting religious freedom. Why didn't we simply advocate for a standalone religious freedom bill? Why didn't we try to address all the issues that Todd has mentioned in one piece of legislation?
Sure. So let me answer two different questions that you kind of ask and they're together, which is, did this bill go far enough? And, Todd responded to that. But I will echo what he said is absolutely this bill did not go far enough. It was very limited in scope. And we as a denomination have been advocating for a much more comprehensive response to these ongoing tensions between LGBTQ rights and religious freedom. The Fairness for All Act, which you all, of course, are familiar with and worked with. And, for the church, for the Adventist Church, the issues of employment, of public accommodation, they're much more pressing to us than what, again, what Todd is saying, rights that have already been established and really are not being challenged. So I absolutely agree. This bill did not go far enough, but it wasn't, as Todd said, crafted or designed to go far enough as far as responding to LGBTQ civil rights. As far as your second question, as far as why are we not advocating for a standalone piece of religious freedom religious freedom legislation? And, I wish we could. I wish that there was an appetite for that in Congress. But, Fairness for All that I mentioned, which was much more comprehensive and had the support, it dealt with both sides of the issue, but it failed in Congress. Legislation that we see that only deals with religious freedom issues just stalls. It doesn't get any sort of, for example, the Defense of Merit, or excuse me, the First Amendment Defense Act. Excuse me, yeah, First Amendment Defense Act. Sorry, I was doing the acronym in my head. Was introduced in a climate of Republican support by Republican senator, and just stalled. So there is not, unfortunately, an appetite for standalone religious freedom legislation. And so that's why we're dealing, with FFA. That's why we have been engaged in the Respect for Marriage Act. So, I wish that there was traction for support of standalone religious freedom legislation, but unfortunately, both in our current political and our current cultural environment, that's just not going to be the case.
And I think, Bettina, one of the things that we felt and why we feel that this bill is better in its current Senate proposed form than not, even though we have not supported or advocated for the passage, but with the religious liberty protections, is it does move the ball incrementally forward. It's not a huge movement, but it does provide, because all the concerns people have raised about, well, this, enshrines same-sex marriage into federal law and makes it policy, that's already the law of the nation, right? And so all the concerns that have been raised about what this bill will do already exist. What doesn't exist in the way that it does right now in federal law is the religious liberty protections. And so that's one of the reasons why, again, we do not support and have not advocated for the passage of RMA, but we do feel like with the religious liberty protections that it does adequately address the concerns that are raised within that bill itself.
So with the congressional discussion around the Respect for Marriage Act, there was some talk in some quarters of more robust religious freedom protections, of broader protections. Why didn't we as a church support those?
Well, I think first of all, those came up late, right? And as far as proposals, and we absolutely would love to have seen those pass, correct? And would have been willing to have advocated for them. The challenge is, and I'll let Melissa talk about this, is I think there's a question. First of all, it goes beyond the scope of the bill. And so like any other negotiation, if you put that in, then what else are you putting in? And then also, you had to look at the political viability of those, but I'll let Melissa talk about that.
No, I think you covered it pretty well, Todd. I think, again, one other thing I could add is we just jumping back to sort of the political reality that we're seeing, as far as, unfortunately, legislation that is more and more robust as far as the religious freedom protections, even if, and I'm pointing to FFA here, even if those LGBTQ rights are included as well, or if there's more of a balancing of rights, we're not seeing an appetite or an interest in that level of religious freedom protection. So we definitely have a lot of work left to do.
Right.
I do want to stress one other thing. We've talked here a lot about the political realities, and if you're engaging in this process, which I think we are called to do, you have to be cognizant of those. I want to be very clear and just reiterate what we said before. None of this is causing us, or have we ever compromised our belief on the definition of marriage and the church's definition, which is based in the Bible and based on our belief in Scripture and spirit of prophecy. And so while we do, sort of the art of the possible, right, as far as what we can get passed in Congress, at no time does that cause us, nor have we ever been asked to compromise our biblical beliefs. And our biblical beliefs are that marriage is between one man and one woman. And that is the stance we took in Obergefell when we filed an amicus brief, cited by Justice Thomas, by the way. And it's our stance here. So please don't confuse the political realities that we're dealing with and sort of the taking, the half a loaf when you can't get a full loaf with compromising anyway, our biblical beliefs.
Right. And, Todd, you're raising an interesting question here, because some people watching may say, well, I'm just not comfortable with the church being engaged in discussions of this type at any level. So, Melissa, going back to the basics, why should the Adventist Church be involved in discussions around a proposed law such as this? Would it be better if we simply kept out of these type of public policy conversations?
Sure. Well, Bettina, our director, Orland Johnson, has a saying. He has many sayings, but one of the ones that is one of my favorites is, he says, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. And I think that that's, a good way of saying we have to be engaged in conversations or discussions or decisions that are made that so deeply affect things that are critical and precious to us, right? Such as religious freedom, such as separation of church and state. Beyond that, there is strong, I think, both biblical and historical church support for civic engagement. We're called to look out for our own interest, to advocate for our own interest, as well as for the best interest of others. And I think that the Seventh-day Adventist Church and its distinct understanding of both religious freedom and the separation of church and state, we shouldn't leave, or we can't leave it to others to defend, as I said before, principles and values that are just so important to us. So, I mean, I think those are many reasons. Again, the biblical and historical church perspective, or we have a long and I think also very successful history of engaging in the political realm.
Okay, well, I think we have covered an immense amount of territory in this conversation today. We've actually gone into the weeds in a way. So we've gotten into the granular details on some of the issues here, but as we wrap up, let's take a few steps back and look at the overview. And, each of you, what would you hope that people watching today would take away from our conversation this afternoon? Todd, let me start with you.
Sure. I think what people should take away, and I'll probably be speaking mainly to our Adventist viewers, which I'm sure is a majority, that the church is engaged on these issues, that it is not a situation where we're looking to compromise our beliefs in any way, and we are not called to compromise them, but protecting our religious liberty is baked into our DNA. It's something we've been doing since our founding, and this is an extension of that. And the mere fact that this bill doesn't have absolutely everything people want in it doesn't mean the church shouldn't be advocating for additional religious liberty protections, which is what we did. And they should be confident that while no one's claiming infallibility here on any of these issues, that these have been looked at carefully with a large group of individuals, both within the church and otherwise in religious liberty, and that they're being well represented in Congress. Well
said, Todd. Melissa?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first of all, we have a lot to be thankful for. We're having this conversation just before the Thanksgiving holiday. And I think one of the things is, again, our church's legislative advocacy work, both current and historical. I think as a Seventh-day Adventist Church member, that's something to be grateful for. And I'm grateful that we had members of Congress who were interested in engaging and addressing the concerns that we had with a particular piece of legislation. I think that that's an example of a healthy and functioning representative government. I mean, and so I think that's really fantastic. Again, talking to our Seventh-day Adventist audience, as students of prophecy, we recognize that religious liberty is not something for us to take for granted. And so vigilance is needed. And so we're going to continue to advocate on behalf of the church as an organization and its members in their religious freedom issues. But I do think that being able to, working with other partners and with members of Congress to get such substantial religious freedom protections in a piece of legislation that is very narrowly tailored in the political environment that we live in, and in a nation that has a over 70% approval rating for same-sex marriage. I think achieving all of that is something that we can be thankful for and grateful for and proud of.
Amen. Todd, Melissa, thank you so much for being willing to be part of this conversation. We have covered a lot, and as you've both made very clear, these are complex issues. These are issues that we are going to have to keep grappling with going into the future. They're issues that we have to keep praying about as well. But I think our discussion has brought some clarity about the Respect for Marriage Act as we continue to see what Congress will do with this proposed law. So thank you everyone for watching. Remember, you can access resources and more information about the Ministry of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty in North America by going to our website, religiousliberty.info. And thanks for being with us today. Take care and God bless.